Welcome back, everybody. It's the first episode of the new academic year, and I'm here with a very special guest, Erik Clemons, the CEO of ConnCorp. Erik was one of my first guests about several years ago when I first joined SOM, and he came to speak as the CEO of ConnCAT, a nonprofit that he started in New Haven. And at the time, was starting to think about a for-profit idea to invest in the community, which is called ConnCorp. And that was still at the idea stage when we last spoke.
Indeed.
So our last conversation, we talked about your work in education and the different layers of impact you were having at the individual, community, state level. And so this time, I want to talk about money. Because you've really shifted your focus to be like, okay, there's only so much we can do with nonprofit social entrepreneurship. And you believe very strongly that we need to invest in Black communities, not as a development or revitalization or charity case, but as a community to be invested in as an economic case. And I feel like that's a message people aren't getting right away, right?
Yeah.
So tell us more about ConnCorp and what it does, and what is the mindset shift you want people to have?
Well, first, thank you for having me, and also for allowing us to extend our conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
This is part two. Yeah. And I'm just so happy to be here with you.
Me too.
And to see you're still here in New Haven. And not only here in New Haven, but rooted in community.
Thank you, Erik.
Yeah.
Actually, I have this constant fear that you'll leave one day because it wouldn't be the same without you.
So, first, ConnCorp is really an outgrowth of the success of ConnCAT. ConnCAT stands for the Connecticut Center for Arts and Technology. And it's really rooted in the idea of building community through the creation of, or the manufacturing of, beauty that will create dignity for mostly Black people who have been living in poverty and are unemployed and underemployed. And so we have workforce development trainings, 2 medical trainings, one in phlebotomy, the other in medical billing and coding, but also we started a new training in bioscience, biopharma called BioLaunch.
Cool.
Yeah, which is really incredible because we wanted to train folks and get them prepared for this new economy that's really blossoming in New Haven around bioscience and biopharma. So an incredible man.
So that everyone can participate.
Exactly. And that's the idea. Like, how do we find entry into that economy? And so an incredible friend, name is Dr. Craig Cruz, who is a bioscientist, entrepreneur, professor here at Yale. He and I became friends around 6-7 years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years. I can't remember, but it seems like a long time. And he and I have been talking about and trying to be strategic about widening and deepening the Black middle class through the advent of biosciences. And so Craig, came up with this idea of a training for Black and brown people living in underserved communities.
So this is new.
This is new, and we just launched it, and a great young man who's running it for us, his name is Dr. Orlando Yarborough, who did a PhD and postdoc here at Yale. He's a geneticist by trade, but now he's running this new initiative, which is absolutely incredible. Have great people on board, a woman named Rebecca Frey and other folks who are in the industry and who are taking on our now soon-to-be graduates. So that's important to note. But now ConnCorp was conceived because we really wanted to think about what we were thinking about, but do something about the next iteration of impact for folks who have gone through our medical training programs and our culinary school that was started, and didn't want those folks to be the working poor, and realize also that folks who have gone through our programs who are now working see the world differently and are navigating their communities differently with a deeper and wider sense of hope. And so what could we do for folks like that? And so myself and my board chair and a man named Paul McCraven, who is now Chief Operating Officer at ConnCorp, started this thing called the Connecticut Community Outreach Revitalization Program, ConnCorp for short. This really was a real kind of economic development, economic justice organization that we started to really affect change in Black communities that were languishing in poverty, namely Dixwell and Newhallville here in New Haven. And so started that organization. Really wasn't a lot of infrastructure there. It was somewhat fraught. And it was really initially a real estate play. We had our sights on the Dixwell Plaza, which is on Dixwell Avenue, which was a declining plaza, kind of left to decline, quite frankly, and and still is an eyesore in Dixwell, in the Dixwell community. And so we felt like that place should look better, given that Dixwell Avenue is a major artery in New
Yeah.
Haven. And so we wanted to do something about that. So we bought one building, which was an old Seatown Market, and thought we would kind of change the trajectory of the community by buying this one building. And that was not a good idea. And so we started thinking wider and deeper and played the long game and said, let's put together a property acquisition strategy, buy the parcels in the plaza, which were 11, including an iconic historic Elks Hall that's on the corner of Dixwell and Webster Street. And so for the last 3.5 years, we've been executing this strategy of acquiring these properties. We became owners of all the properties within the last year, and now have put a fence around the entire 8 acres and are about to demolish the entire block.
It sounds almost impossible that you could just go in there and buy up all these properties that weren't even related to each other and create this new neighborhood.
It was very, very difficult. And also a point of clarity. So now ConnCorp is now a nonprofit as well.
Oh, really? Okay.
But it's a nonprofit that has business lines. And so...
Because it is a real estate company, right?
It is. Well, mainly a real estate company, but the way I like to see it is a where we do have these business lines that are looking to be profitable.
Right. It's self-sustaining.
Right. Exactly.
It's not relying on philanthropy
Exactly.
forever.
But it's for the purpose of helping people, not just for the purpose of making money.
Exactly.
Which is really a distinction to me.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, I mean, why does it have to be a distinction? Because the vibe I always get from our conversations is that it doesn't have to be two different things, and that you help people by making money and by developing the community and by helping them make money, and that you don't want it to be like a charity case, right?
No, exactly. And so if I think about it, right, if I think about ConnCorp and its business, so we have 3 food businesses, Petals Market, Orchid Cafe, which you know very well, and Orchid Catering, right? And so,
we just had Orchid Catering in class last time. It was so good.
I heard.
I recommend anyone order Orchid Catering if they can.
No, Gideon, who is our VP of hospitality, and he's just an absolute amazing man, Gideon Gibricius. And so we have these businesses. We just opened another cafe called Recess Cafe, which is in the lab at ConnCorp, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so these are our revenue generating businesses. Now, to your point and to the earlier point, the idea of making money, not just for the sake of making money, but for making money to sustain those businesses and those businesses employing people and being a service to the community is super, super important to me, right? And that is part of our mission.
And also the concept of like, I remember one of the misconceptions at the beginning was like, why would you invest tens of millions of dollars in this community? Like, if you think about why is that the best use of money for economic development, it's like people wouldn't be asking that question in another neighborhood.
Absolutely.
That was kind of my point.
Absolutely. And so, no, you're right. And so the large project that called ConnCAT Place on Dixwell is just that, right? It's an almost $200 million project that we're in the midst of a raise right now for the purpose of bringing beauty, dignity, and utility to the Dixwell and New Hallville communities.
Yeah, you shouldn't have to justify that.
Exactly. No different than what would happen in South Norwalk, as we were just talking about, right? A huge mall now on the edge of South Norwalk, just for the purpose of bringing utility and service and economy to that particular area.
I guess economy is the word I'm looking for rather than money, because then economy is the purpose of money and the purpose of investing.
Exactly. And so the idea of our business lines, and as well as ConnCAT Place on Dixwell or the lab at ConnCorp, is to create economic infrastructure in communities that have been historically languishing in poverty. Like, that's really the aim here.
Exactly. what I learned from you is that these neighborhoods have been underinvested in due to racism.
That's right.
And that's why they're dilapidated. And it really took a private company and a private effort to say it doesn't need to languish like
That's
this.
right.
Like, let's revitalize it.
That's right. That's right. And that's really, for me, that's really the crux of the matter, right? How do we aggressively address poverty? And a poverty that not only has decimated, in my opinion, a neighborhood or two neighborhoods especially, but a poverty that has also allowed people not to really think differently about what could be possible other than what they see. Right. And so poverty, it's not only the scarcity of resources, but it also, there's a psychic pain that comes with poverty. And I know this to be true because I was once living in poverty as a kid. And I saw the symptoms of poverty every day on the faces and in the hearts of people that I lived in proximity to in my neighborhood. And so the question is, how do we change not only the circumstances of the people who are living in poverty, but also the minds and the hearts of those people, while at the same time, hopefully, addressing the minds and the hearts of people who have everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Change the way both see the world.
That's right. That's right. And see each other.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
see themselves.
That's right.
Speaking of seeing themselves, I want to ask you about your personal trajectory because I remember learning that you started off working at USPS, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
then served as a volunteer on the board of a youth NGO and
That's
then
right.
became its executive director and then started ConnCAT, became the CEO and
Yeah.
now ConnCorp. And for a while, maybe considered going to seminary, right?
I went to seminary.
You did?
I did. I graduated with a degree in theology
wow.
and ethics.
Okay. So
Yeah.
you've been asking yourself the question over the years and decades of what is my role in the world and
Yeah.
how do I want to shape the world?
Yeah.
So how has your understanding of your role evolved at different stages in your life? And how are you thinking about it now that's different maybe than it was 5 years ago?
Yeah, great questions, and these are conversations you and I have all the time since
Yeah,
we met.
exactly.
I've always, even as a youngster, although I couldn't think critically about it, but I've always been thinking about the human condition, right, and what part the human spirit has in creating the human condition. And so, I didn't do well in school when there, and it wasn't because I wasn't smart and I couldn't learn. I hated school, but I loved to learn, right? I just didn't see school as having something that I would be
Yeah.
interested in, and quite frankly, we were so poor that, we always had to move because we were being evicted from everywhere we lived. And, my mom did the best she could. I mean, she's an incredible woman. But, it was very, very difficult being a single parent with 3 children. And so we were always moving. And so my academic career was always uncertain. And so I focused on what would be certain, right? And that was trying to educate myself. And so I read everything I could get my hands on. And I read it to the extent that I could understand what I was reading, but I was always been captivated by word construct and how words can evoke feelings and emotions and dreams. And so always thinking about those things. Got a job at the Postal Service and I worked there, a very noble job, and worked there for 16 years, but always thinking about what could I do differently and what more can I do as it relates to contributing to the world. And so I went to school and I went to community college first and kind of found out I had some ability. And then I applied at Southern Connecticut State University. And we had moved to New Haven, we being my wife and my 4 daughters. And then went to school full time and I worked at the Postal Service full time. And I graduated with a degree in sociology. I was 34 years old at this point. And had some dreams of going to law school. And so a dear friend of mine who Rick Brooks, whose wife Heidi works here, teaches here at SOM. Rick is a dear friend of mine who he and I grew up together in Norwalk, Connecticut. And he was a law professor at Yale at the time. And he and I had kept talking about, how to and when to apply to law school. And so when it was time for me to do so, I went to UConn Law School to their open house, my wife and I, and walked out of UConn Law School, and across the street was Hartford Seminary.
Hmm.
And my wife looked at me, she said, "You need to go there." And so I agreed, of course. And so I went in there, I applied, and now have a degree in theology and ethics, and was going to do a PhD in systematic theology at Boston University School of Theology. But I chose to go and work in community at the organization that you mentioned
I do
before.
see you doing a PhD one day, not
Yeah.
full time because you have too much going on. But when I was introducing you earlier, I almost said, and here I have with me Dr. Erik Clemons. It just like felt like that's what I should be saying. So like
Yeah.
at some point that's going to happen, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. The closest I have is an honorary doctor from Albertus
Well, there
Magnus.
you go. So I can call you Dr. Erik
Yeah.
Clemons. Okay, cool.
But it's so interesting that I've been steeped in education, being a education fellow at Aspen, and
Mhm.
I'm a member of the State Board of Education,
Mhm.
and I'm a trustee at Quinnipiac University, yet didn't do well in school.
Well, I think the schools you were in were not designed for you to thrive.
That's right.
It's just totally different. And that's what you're trying to change, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to change. And it's so interesting you said that because, I would imagine even now that young people like me, they can feel something very wrong in this place. They don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And it is that, right? That some schools, if not most schools, and some teachers who are in front of these children who's supposed to be
Yeah.
teaching them don't even like the children, and definitely don't like the neighborhood that they are teaching in. And so there needs to be something to be done about that as well. But yeah, so those are some of the things that I've been trying to address, whether it is at ConnCAT or ConnCorp, or just being in community, having conversations with people, trying to be in authentic relationships with people to the extent that I can deeply understand what the issues are and what the beauties and the hope is as well. And not just Black folks who are experiencing poverty, but also white folks who have everything, right? How can I be
Yeah.
a bridge or acquire a language to speak to both in a way that is convincing and in a way that brings people together? Because, I believe that no matter how much we talk about race in a very divisive way, or even in a way of unity, right? Or whatever we talk about within the public square, if we do not come together, we will all lose. And the worst thing is people who think they're winning, but they're really losing.
Yeah. So if you were going to imagine a totally different future in terms of thinking about what needs to happen and what would it look like if everything you're saying came true, let's say you built the ConnCAT Plaza at Dixwell
Mm-hmm.
and help create jobs, bring money into the community, change people's perception of what is possible. And then fast forward 20 years, let's say,
Yeah.
what would it look like for this to happen, what you're describing?
What would it look like for this to happen? First, there needs to be funds, resources devoted to the work that we are endeavoring to do in Dixwell especially. I think in the end, Theresa, what I want, it is not for people who have nothing or very little to have everything, right? If that's the case, that is the ideal situation, that all people have everything. But in some, what's most important to me and what I think is justice is that those who have nothing have enough. And them having enough has nothing to do or doesn't take away from people who have everything. And there be some common understanding of both positions, no matter race. And not only a common understanding, but a common language between those two opposite poles of living and existing in the world. That's the ideal situation for me. But in order for us to do the work that we endeavor to do, we have to raise funds, we have to raise awareness, and we have to bring people together in a way that speaks to people's ability to be courageous enough and vulnerable enough to be with each other.
Can you share with us a little bit about how you're doing that? So I started off saying we're going to talk about money, remembering that you have tens, and now I'm realizing hundreds of millions of dollars that you're raising in order to invest in this community.
That's right.
So how are you doing this? What you just described, like raising money, bringing people together, developing a common language. What does that look like?
Yeah, it's very difficult, because you're I'm working and not just myself, but I have an incredible group of people who work with me, and we're working on the capital stack for this project, especially, where there's tranches of debt, there's a tranche of philanthropy, there's equity. There is state funding. The state of Connecticut has been very generous to us and continues to be and believe in what we are doing. The city also. And so it is every aspect of my talking with people is not only for the aim of raising money, but raising awareness and bringing people together and bringing people closer to this ground zero that we call Dixwell Avenue. And you do this at the level of comfort of those people. And so it's not just about fundraising for me, right? It is about awareness raising as well.
That's true. Like once you raise awareness, the funds will come.
Exactly, right? And the only way to do that is to be in relationship with people. And the way to be in authentic relationship is to be credible and honest with people. And so it's always that daily, those conversations, those nuances of relationship, addressing the needs of people, all people, right? And addressing the fears of people while working to get to a place of hope.
Yeah, and it's really the process itself that makes the difference.
That's it.
A lot of people are always asking how they can replicate or scale the outcome itself, which is that economic development, the change in awareness and attitudes and mindsets. But I don't think the outcome can just be copy pasted or multiplied.
Yeah.
I think you have to go through that process. And I think that it has to happen at the community level, like places like Dixwell all around the country and the world. Like the community has to go through the process of having those conversations, building those relationships, right? Building the awareness, and then the investments will come.
Yeah, that you're absolutely right. And what I don't want to do, especially in this conversation, is paint the picture that this community is desolate and without leadership and without spirit. It's huge spirit.
Exactly.
In Dixwell, beautiful people who care deeply about their community and about humanity. And so what I've learned is you can't judge a community based on sections of that community and how it looks. But sitting with people, talking with people, failing in those conversations, failing miserably, quite frankly. Presenting the project more than I presented myself was a huge failure, and I talk about that readily. And, just being open and honest with people to the point where they accept you. And, never thinking that I even wanted to be accepted, but I realized I did by people. And it made the work even easier, and it made the conversations even easier with them, but also with other folks who don't live there. Because I felt like I could be a credible witness to what is happening in community, especially Dixwell and Newhallville. Incredible witness, and if I'm a credible witness, then I can definitely be a credible reporter when I talk to other folks about the power of these people in this community.
And in social innovation, they call this process that you're describing sensing.
Wow.
Because it refers to just going into a community and using all your senses to learn and listen and just open up and present yourself.
I never heard of that. That's interesting.
It's so funny because we were just talking about how it's the process that has to be replicated, right? Like in different settings. And I was just reminded while you were describing this process of when I was in Indonesia in February. and I met with a social entrepreneur who does very different work. Her goal is to create sustainable food supply chains to help preserve indigenous plant species in Indonesia. So she lives in Jakarta, the capital, but she goes to remote islands like Papua, because Indonesia is like thousands of islands. And she meets with indigenous people whose livelihood depends on nature. And so she works with them to understand their relationship with nature and to help create these sustainable food markets to support their livelihoods and nature. And so when I went to meet with her with a faculty member in Jakarta who had invited me there, that faculty member asked her, well, how do you deliver your vision to them? When you go to these remote islands and meet with indigenous people, how do you deliver your ideas? And she said, the social entrepreneur replied, you're asking the wrong question. I don't go and present my ideas and deliver my vision. I go just to do sensing, like just to listen and learn and be present and create connection. And I can't have a predetermined agenda, especially when you're working in such a nature-centered environment where people's survival depends on sensing nature, right? Being aware of what's around them, the threats and everything. And so humans are nature, so they will sense you if you go there with an agenda. And you won't be able to build trust with them.
Such a great point.
And that's exactly what you're describing right now. It's like first connect as humans.
That's right.
Instead of like having your slide decks and your flip charts and everything.
Yes.
And then the existing assets, the community assets, not just nature or buildings, but also like knowledge, social capital, cultural capital, everything, then it will all come into place.
That's so true and so profound. What I've learned is assumptions will get you to accusations, you know. And also what I've learned, which is probably the most important thing that I've learned, is through helping or thinking I'm helping someone else, I'm discovering myself.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's what your friend was talking about. There's a lot of self-discovery in the work that I do.
There really is.
If in fact you are honest about the work you are trying to do.
It's so true, Erik. And a few episodes ago, we had an SOM alumna named Daisy Rosales on the podcast. And she quoted an Aboriginal activist from Australia who said, if you are coming here to save me, then go home. If you are coming here because your liberation is tied to mine, then let us work together.
That's right. Amen.
And that's exactly the case.
Right.
It's also about like your salvation, not just the people you're working with.
So true. So true. And I had to be honest about that fact, that my salvation is tied to my trying to help people, right? And so a victory in helping people is also, in some, a victory for me.
Yeah, and I think what you were describing earlier of like not just people who live in Dixwell, but people who don't and have everything, it's like they don't have everything actually. In order for them to thrive, everyone needs to thrive.
That's right.
And that's your vision.
That's what the vision is.
Thank you so much, Erik, for doing this work. And thanks for taking the time to come share it with us.
Oh, thank you for creating space to talk about the things I care about.
Thank you. I always manage to make it about more than just money.
That's all right.
Thanks.